Yo, what's up?
Yo, what's going on?
You always sound so chill.
That is me. I've always sounded the same, as long as I can remember.
Is that the California thing?
It must be, I don't know, I've been getting accused of being a pothead since I was like in middle school, so I mean, this is just unfortunately what I was born with.
I think it's a great thing to have going for you. But let's not get too jumpy right there. Feel free to introduce yourself on what you're up to and all these other goodies, you know?
Okay. Well, my name is Dove. Well, that's my alias. My actual name is Dana. I am technically doxxed, so I mean, who cares? I've been making art as long as I can remember. Um, I used to draw these like crazy one-line drawings starting from like the age of 2 that my family still has. Just drawing these crazy scenes of like these characters dancing and stuff, and like I would literally never pick up the pencil. So I've been doing this pretty much as long as I can remember. Um, I didn't really start taking it seriously until the end of high school. More of my focus, I think, was like on journalism and just I was always told that, art wasn't really a career that you could have in your lifetime. It was always something that you would become famous for after you died or something. And I come from um a family that, really believes in like working hard and waking up every morning at like 4 in the morning and doing whatever job you got to do to get shit done. And so, I had experiences where like I literally got in trouble for taking an art class in high school because I was failing like so many other classes just because I hated school. And so, just things like that. But eventually, especially with Web3, I kind of got into, or I got the idea that maybe it was possible. Like I had gotten into some galleries and stuff. Like I had a show in Seattle. I had some shows in high school that were local to Southern California and things like that. But I always just looked at it as this like impossible game until Web3 came around. So I've been here since I want to say the beginning of the pandemic, just really kind of being a part of the community, just seeing what's going on, getting connected with people, putting my art out there, doing mostly physical work, um, until eventually, somebody had handed me a stylus for my iPhone and I downloaded Procreate and I did this little quick abstract drawing of like two people kissing. I posted it at like 5 in the morning and it blew up. It got like 100,000 likes. I have no idea why. To this day, every time I post it, it still blows up. But that was kind of the piece for me that made me realize that maybe this was attainable like in my lifetime. And so after that, I started minting. I just went really crazy with it. I worked with Known Origin as one of their ambassadors. I ran the Dark Art Show where we interviewed like I want to say close to 100 different artists in the space, like Charisma, Terrell Jones, Alec, all the people from making it. Um, and had a number of shows and stuff, and it just kept going. But that's really my background here in Web3. Not necessarily my background in my life, and that I feel like is a little bit more important than some of the accomplishments and things that I've done here. But yeah, I think that's a fair introduction to me.
A very extensive one at that. Speedy far from your journalistic kind of inclination.
Well, thank you. Do you like to be thorough?
Being thorough never hurts. Not here on Whiz at least. So hot take time. Um, is would you say that when it comes to being creative overall, um, who's more likely to be the most talented? Someone who has access to resources and the wealth that they need to just create freely, or someone who's coming from the gutter? See what I did there?
I see what you did, and I'm glad that was used appropriately because the gutter in my name is definitely not from those PFPs. Personally, though, to answer your question, I feel like both instances are irrelevant in terms of like who can be more creative. I think more often than not, it's the people that do have access to resources that get, the attention that they deserve and are actually kind of like renowned for their abilities to be creative. So I think that's where like we see that dichotomy often. Um, but I think that talent is kind of equally spread out through everybody. And I mean, it really depends. Like, talent and creativity comes in so many different ways. I don't think that any earthly things are relevant to the amount of talent that you have. I think that that's something that is just given to everybody in their own like unique ways. I do think that there are circumstances that happen to certain people that make it so that certain talents that they have aren't fulfilled to their full potential. Um, but yeah, I think it's kind of all the way across the board. Kind of everybody's got something, and some people are better in certain areas than others, but some people don't get the opportunity to shine like they should.
So if you were to give a basic elevator pitch as to, why you should get the spotlight and why everyone should give you attention, like what angle would you go for?
Man, well, that's a really good question. Kind of surprised at these interview questions so far. I think that one is definitely harder to answer than the previous question because I'm somebody that does not do well marketing themselves. I don't know if it's, maybe it's just a lack of confidence, because I do fall into the category of people that do not have access to resources. So if I had to pitch it, I think I would probably go in that direction because there is one thing that I do know, and whether or not it sounds arrogant, I think also is irrelevant because to a certain degree, we kind of need that when you're marketing yourselves. But I do think that I am one of those people that has the talent, that has the creativity, that, can really pretty much touch any medium of, creating, whether it's digital, whether it's freaking sculpting, painting, whatever it is. Like, I am somebody that is exceptionally good at all of those things. And I think that I have a certain element of taste, even when it comes to, curation, with other artists, like putting on shows and stuff, like, that most people don't have. And I think that that is valuable. I think that my life experience and the things that I've gone through to become the person that I am is also equally as invaluable as what I previously mentioned because, um, I'm not somebody that shit was just handed to. Like, I personally have a pretty realistic idea of the way the world works to the point where it can enter pessimistic, ideologies and things like that because I have faced like a ridiculous amount of adversities, like personal adversities, and I think that that in particular fuels my art. I make a lot of pieces that I'm not sure if people are aware are actually very angry pieces because of these things. And so that anger that I have for the things that I've faced in life ultimately is what fuels my drive. Um, Also, love and all the good things in life or is the other opposite end of the spectrum that, I do take inspiration from. But as of lately, with the way that things in life have gone, I think a lot of it does come from that, like that feeling of needing to come out on top of, whatever those circumstances are. So I personally think, like, me as a person, I feel like really the shit that I've overcome in life and the type of person that I am is somebody that really should be championed behind. And I think that that coupled with my actual talent and my skill and my ability to create, regardless of those circumstances, regardless of the attention that it garners, regardless of what resources I have or don't have, I think that that combination together is what makes me somebody that you should really bet on. Um, and I identify that in a lot of other people in the community, because it's like sometimes you have people that really don't have the talent, that don't have the skill, but they have that life story or that personality behind them, and that makes people want to champion them, or vice versa. People have the talent and the skill, but they're terrible people. And I've always said that, like, we really need to be finding the artists that are a little bit of both, ends of the spectrum. Like, they're people that really deserve it, and the people that really have the talent. Like, those are the people that should be championed in this space, and I don't see it often enough, and I do consider myself to fall into that category. So I think that's probably what I would have to put as my pitch. Just being honest.
Interesting. So, I think a couple of the things you've said definitely are worth dissecting. So we'll start with the marketing angle. Um, when you say marketing, what do you?
Um, well, back in the day, we used to have art agents that would kind of do this shit for us, and marketing in the sense of, like, getting your work out there, connecting with the collectors, mostly just those two things, like finding a way to create some hype around your work, trying to accurately portray yourself in a way that makes people want to stand behind your work. I personally don't feel like I do a very good job at talking to people. I find it hard to kind of get my point across. I wouldn't say in this instance, because, like, I'm familiar with you, and I think that over time I've kind of gained a little bit more confidence. But it's just the ability that you have to know what you're worth here, because you're the only person that's gonna champion you, like, from the beginning. And that's what the marketing aspect, kind of starts with in my head, right? Is like knowing that you have something that is going to be seen as valuable, whether it's, 6 months down the line or 6 years, maybe it's 60 years, but in your heart that you have something that people are going to want. And I think that that's where it starts for people that do become successful, if it's not just some moment of sheer luck, right? Um, so that's what I think of as marketing here, because I find it hard to talk about money, just coming from a place where, like, I've never really been around a lot of money. So trying to like say, oh, my shit is worth X amount of dollars, or it's worth like some crazy amount, like 10 grand to me is crazy. I mean, it can be hard for somebody like that. So everything else afterwards probably falls in line once you decide that um, you deserve a certain amount or whatever, a certain, like, lifestyle that comes along with it. So, or just knowing your worth in general.
It's pretty evident that um, everyone struggles with this current wave of social media. It used to be that algorithms didn't really rule everything, and now we're seeing this stance that really it's saturated and it's hard to stand out. And I I I try to offer a different alternative in terms of perspectives, and I will say for one that it's not that it's, saturated or um what you're making is not good whatsoever. It's more so that when it comes to understanding, the language of a platform, it has a big uh, a part to play in this. Imagine being an artist, that posts on TikTok, for example, a lot of folks will assume that TikTok is a platform that does, images, static, that is, and yeah, you can, but the problem is that the core of TikTok is not built like that. So inherently, you're funding up against, the very nature of the app and how people publish content there. So I think a little bit of observation in terms of the culture and climate of a particular platform helps a ton. And that applies just as well to the Web3 ones, Super Rare and Foundation and Rarible and tons of many others. They may say they do the same thing, but they could not be more different in the way they are curated, to the way they spotlight artists, to even the way you know announce a drop there. If you notice, some artists in particular really like to emphasize a drop that they have on Super Air, and that's for the reason that a lot of them, a lot of the artists there are very reputable people. So that kind of reputation helps in terms of traction, and it does help too. But it's at this golden gate kind of phase where only a select few, to my knowledge, has gotten on this platform. So yeah, like leveraging it in such a way where you can take advantage of, that prestige. That's another way to speak the language of a platform.
Right. I mean, from a lot of the conversations that we've had, that this is definitely something that, I'm personally aware of. I mean, you can't have been here for 3 years and not be aware of some of these things too. I know the algorithm is definitely fucking a lot of us. That's for sure. A lot of us just don't know how to take advantage of it, myself included. I'm personally not tech savvy in that way, nor do I really have an interest to really study the algorithm in the way that like you have. However, I do study, in a social sense, the way that things kind of move in the community. And I know that there are certain things that can be leveraged. I know that every platform moves differently, especially Super Rare. Like, oh, yeah, it gets me frustrated. I think, for me, there's a certain level of I want to say like discontent that I have with some of the ways that the platforms and the community have run themselves. And there are certain things that, I wish would be done differently, that are a little bit too similar to the way that the traditional art market is run itself. It's obviously kind of what happens when a large amount of money enters the playing field. Um, and so it's just like, I think that there is some level of disappointment, because when I came into Web3, I was like, oh my God, it's a renaissance. Like, I'm going to get myself to NFT NYC, even if I have $2 in my pocket, when I get there, because this is where I need to be. And just kind of encountering like handfuls of the wrong people just kind of puts that sour taste in my mouth, and kind of made me want to just start operating in a different way. So part of that lack of success there is probably due to a little bit of pessimism that's grown in me from the way that I've seen things operate, and just being here so long, and being a part of these groups of people that have become success stories, mingling with people that are considered to be the greats of our era now, and yet still like sitting in the shadows. So I think I have to remind myself. Like, I recently watched the documentary on Rick James, who has always been one of my favorite musicians. Just his style, his attitude, the music, the way it sounds. Like, seriously one of my favorites. And I watched this documentary recently about how when he was real young, like it took him like 10 years before he really got noticed. And he was just rubbing shoulders with all of these people that went on to become, really revered musicians like Neil Young. Like he started a band with Neil Young in Canada when I think he was like escaping the draft or something, like for Vietnam. And so it's like, who would think that like, Rick James would have been in a band with Neil Young, like two totally different types of music, right? But that kind of made me realize like, even though somebody might be in a position to where they're surrounded by all this quote unquote greatness and they're not, seeing their time come, like eventually that shit will happen. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of went off on a tangent there. I feel like it's somehow related though, because like just in the area of like feeling that, discomfort of like, damn, like why haven't I made it yet? I'm just trying to remember that this is kind of common for a lot of people that actually genuinely do have talent. So,
Okay. Yeah, and speaking of, talent, algorithm, and, and tons of other things like that, I've spoken at length with a wide variety of people, as you're probably aware by now, and I think, that's what really gives me the advantage that I have as far as, quote unquote, studying the algorithm, because effectively, I'm studying people at the end of the day, not machines.
mhm.
I pay attention to habits, I pay attention to the climate, and more importantly, I pay attention to trends, because say what you want about trend, but this idea that trends are bad makes no sense to me, because the Renaissance was a trend, right? Impressionism was also a trend. Cubism was also a trend. So it's very interesting for me to notice this approach that a lot of creatives and non-creatives alike having when it comes to trends and how they represent, and this idea that either creating one or participating in one or even, you know, having a trend as something that's part of your branding, suddenly it dilutes from the value of what you have to offer. And again, like this is why I offer an alternative perspective and say that actually trends very much do it in the same way that social media are also tools. It is a tool for you to, you know, hijack the conversation and, get your little spotlight and sunshine. And I think if more artists thought that way, a whole lot more of them would be, or at the very least, be aware of. I don't know about success, because success means something different to everybody. But yeah, trends can be helpful. Like I mean, when it comes to trends, I think one can argue that this piece I'm about to show you is a trend, and if you go over to the jumbotron up above, you'll see an image that depicts, a bunch of, I would assume, children, wearing masks and stuff, and depicting that kind of reality post 2020 in itself. That's a trend. I don't know if there's a name for it, but I've seen some artworks that are similar in that kind of fashion. And every time they do pop up, they get a lot of traction, because that social commentary is surprisingly not very common amongst the arts sphere.
Oh yeah, no, I'm definitely familiar with her work for sure. I know her stuff has blown up and been all over the timeline occasionally, like every few months. I've seen this painting. I think, she's got a lot of skill, technical skill. And I see what you're saying in terms of the subject matter being kind of what pushes that into maybe more of a trend, because I also don't see a lot of people talking about that as well. But, here's what I'll say about the trends. So there's kind of two perspectives that I've heard over and over again. And, I kind of identify with maybe some portions of this. these two perspectives, but I think one reason why artists don't like the trends is simply because their shit is not trending. Like, first and foremost, because if your shit was trending, you would be like, okay, cool, like my shit is trending. I'm that hot new thing. But so it's a little bit of envy, I think, that comes from artists. You know, when you see, like, say for example, somebody like Tijo or like Terrell Jones, who's, you know, both of their works have been considered very quote unquote trendy within like the last year. Um, or even with recent controversies like Photon's dead. People like that, you know, have mastered the algorithm, that have somehow made it so that their work is trending. Yeah, I think the first one is envy, and then the second one, which is more of like an insecurity and a fear, which I feel like I identify a little bit heavier with this, is that, say for example, if you do manage to become one of those artists, like let's take Ferocious, right? Somebody that was highly trendy, like back in especially the beginning of 2021 all the way through to the end of the year. um you know, you see those artists that are getting that level of fame, like being pushed into this certain box. And like, you know, I was just tweeting about this the other day, how there's artists that I followed on Instagram like 10 years ago back in high school, that whose work like I revered and you know, was following, wondering how they got into galleries. Like, I literally just saw some of those artists like 2 days ago making the exact same work that they were making 10 years ago. And it begs the question in my mind, like, do you even enjoy it? Like, do you get to a certain point as a creator to where like you have forced yourself into a certain box, like through this level of success, to now where if you make anything that steps outside of that realm of what you're known for, it instantly sells for less or never gets sold. And so getting into these trends, like, it's almost like a double-edged sword. Like, yeah, you're gonna be making probably a lot of money off of, you know, what fits into that category, but at what point do you as an artist get tired of creating work that looks like that? Like, you know, for me personally, I like to make work in a lot of different styles. Like, there is definitely some flow to what I do, but I've done all kinds of shit because I don't know, I get bored of it easily. And so that's where I personally find it difficult and a little bit scary to lean into the trends, because then you've got collectors expecting a certain thing from you. And you might find yourself in a situation where 5 years down the road, you're sick of making the shit that falls into the trends. And then what do? You have a lot of money, but are you happy about the things you're creating? And so it's like, I personally would like to find a way to create work that somehow is trendy, but is able to change. Is something that's dynamic, because with the trends, like you see it in Web3 too, like the people that are taking off, like they're still making the same shit. And that's what I think of is like, do you enjoy it?
I see. There's this creator I follow. They're known as Dan Co. And they talk a lot about marketing, branding, and all these things. And what I really like about him is that he takes a practical and actionable approach to discussing these things. He doesn't overhype it. He doesn't overproductize it. And one of his infographic he's published talks about that concept, right? So when you're one person that publishes anything on the internet, you're effectively a one-person business. And what you do is the brand, and how you do it is the product, and why you do it is the marketing. And all of these aspects tie back into content. And that content is what you put out there to represent your business. And it's interesting that you brought up this idea that, you know, collectors and really anyone that sees a particular work from you, their exposure to that work from that point forward is likely to be what they think of your brand to be as, because that's what they saw from you. That's what you do. Um, if they pay attention long enough and they try to keep tabs on, your process and how you do it, that would let them know a little bit more about you. But, with the attention so-called economy where people tend to move on really quickly, and that's mostly a fault of the tools that we use, not so much of the people themselves, because I guarantee you, had the tools been built differently, people would be engaging with the art that they consume differently as well. Because a lot of the incentive there is to make sure to keep people as hooked on any platform for as long as possible. And typically, what gets people hooked tend to lean on the unhealthy side. I would point out the documentary, The Social Dilemma, as like a example of what that looks like practically. But point being made that you won't be able, you can't control who sees your work and when they see the work and what they attach to said work at that point. What you can control, though, is that process through which you can disseminate the work and showcase your process of how you do it, um, or why you do it, which is, that it ties right into the marketing aspect. And funny enough, like a lot of what I started to do with this Whistle concept actually ties right back into that. People don't think too much of interviews and podcasts as marketing material. And if they do, then that would be my opportunity to educate them a little bit about what that means. Because when you think of anyone that's currently at the top of their game in the social media sphere, right? It could be Gary Vee, it could be Kim Kardashian, it could be what's their face? That really popular musician kid, Billie Eilish. All of these people in some capacity have leveraged either the power of, podcasting or the power of having ongoing discourse made about them. And that's really what an interview is at the end of the day. It is discourse made about something. And for me, like, it's more or less one and the same, whether it's fans discussing an artist on the Twitter timeline and arguing about who's better or who's worse, or even debates amongst artists themselves that, debate whether or not Ferocious deserves their spot as like a famed artist, or whether Beeple should have had their notorious, $60 million sale and what have you. All of that is marketing funnel. And even though, the name is controversial, Andrew Tate, once again, is a good example of what that looks like when someone exploit, the very nature of all these internet tools that we use. Because he, at least like when he was on the come up, he was not posting any of this himself. He had people do it for him. And the way he's got there is by incentivizing people through an affiliate marketing scheme where essentially every time someone clicks a link in the bio of the account that reposted the content featuring him, they get a cut of whatever he's selling. So, that is someone that understands business through and through, that leverages the social media in its nature that leans towards virality.
Hmm. Very interesting take. Very interesting take. I can see a lot of good points in there. But one thing that did come to mind though, when you were talking about, for example, how maybe people don't realize that spaces, were something that could be leveraged for marketing. I want to argue that that's not true. I think that people were really taking advantage of spaces and like Clubhouse and things like that specifically for that purpose. And what I saw at least was like, say when Spaces came out, everybody was like, "Oh, cool! We can all sit here and really get to know everybody." But the issue that I really saw with it was the fact that it seemed like everybody was leveraging it for their own personal marketing, that it became this thing that was so disingenuous that it no longer works, because when people go into spaces for the most part now, they know that that's most of the reason why people are doing spaces. Like, even if it seems like they're coming off as friendly, even if it seems like people are just having bullshit, spaces to hang out with their friends, at the end of the day, one thing I realized about Web3 is like it really is about business. And, kind of back to like the trend things is like, or oh, what you were saying about, people that, know how to market their brand. And I think that to a certain degree that's also an issue with the way that we operate here, is that everybody is like trying to be a brand. Like, I don't know how one person, I don't know if one person should be a brand, because that comes with certain responsibilities. It comes with, certain boxes that, like I said earlier, that you get put into. And so it's like being a brand honestly kind of sounds miserable. Like, I think about these things because that's what I personally witnessed. Like, I was running spaces, I was very heavily into spaces for, most of 2021, all of 2022. I know what it's like. I see the people, I see what they're doing, and that's to me what it is people that everybody here is very like money hungry. I think that everybody, especially the artists, came here looking for certain opportunities. We're sold this idea that it was going to be this renaissance and everybody for the first time ever was going to be able to become famous in their lifetime and to make money, as an artist in their lifetime. Like, you weren't going to have to do it like posthumously. And so that attracted a fuck ton of people, which is like where people complain about the oversaturation, the lack of soul in the art here, because a lot of people came in strictly for money. And I can't sit here and lie and say that the money wasn't enticing. I too would love to be able to live off of my art. But at the end of the day, this is something that I was doing long before any of these opportunities arise. And there are people like that in the community, that have been doing this for much longer than Web3 existed. And it isn't necessarily like the money isn't necessarily their base reason for coming into the community. But I do think that as much as you're right about everything that you're saying, I think to a certain level, it's like a paradox. It somehow also creates obstacles for everybody here, because people are not creating from a genuine place. People are not interacting with each other from a genuine place. It's like you've got people that don't even talk to you unless you have a certain number of followers, or if you're not getting 1,000 likes a post on your art, like, you're not considered to be a part of these cliques. And these cliques are all based off of, who brands themselves the best and who has the most amount of reach and pull within the community. And it's not unlike anything that, we haven't seen before. But I personally feel like there's a certain degree of it that just kind of sucks the soul out of it. Honestly. Like, I don't think you're wrong, but I do think that it adds to the soul sucking behavior that we're all kind of experiencing here. So it's like, what do you do about that? How do you have the best of those both worlds? Like,
You see, yeah, I mean, the point you're making is supplemental to what I just said. Ultimately, we're not disagreeing about anything. And I will say though that the whole branding conversation, for me at least, I feel like people overthink it way too much. People have this mentality that it's supposed to be rocket science when it really should not be. And that ties into the whole branding conversation too, where, branding, when I say branding, what I specifically mean is just, whoever is behind the thing. That's really what branding comes down to. Whether it's, Billie Eilish or Skrillex or Frank Sinatra or Disney, immediately when I say branding, you know what I mean, because you know exactly what to expect, And personality ties to branding. The nature of your posts and the content of what you discuss ties to branding. As a matter of fact, I've had this conversation with another artist in this space who started off as a traditionalist and then came in into Web3, not for the money reason, but more so for the chance to preserve, the art stuff. And I was talking about the fact that, well, what do you document in your art and what do you hope to say through the art? And they said, that they're only looking to showcase beauty. They're not looking to bop people over the head with heavy topics. Um, and for me, that was odd, because art is a medium that says a lot about society, whether that's, recepted well by the listener, it's another matter. But when I think of art, I think Banksy. I think, that famous picture of Che Guevara. I think of graffiti and hip hop culture and stuff like that. And all these people boldly said things in the face of people you would argue wouldn't care to listen, even if they were paid to do it. So now these people have officially taken space and took over the discourse, and now we have people who simply prefer to just, make cute things, and nothing wrong with that. But it does hint at something more for me when someone actively chooses to step away from that, knowing that they could say something, um, because their brand is a brand that doesn't want to alienate or doesn't want to come at the cost of expression. And, at the end of the day, it is a personal decision. I'm not going to pull it. Good old helicopters. Thank you, Ellie. But like, yeah, like, at the end of the day, like this idea that, artists here are incentivized, that's not new. And how they put themselves out there, whether in generally disingenuous, decent, you know what I mean, disingenuously, like these people, at the end of the day, it is a brand that they're curating for people to see. And one of my biggest personal pet peeve, that I'm very aware that I'm guilty of on my main page is that for someone who, talks about the whole art stuff all the time, if you go on my feed, you won't really see much of it. It's mostly shit posting. But then it hit me that, oh, okay, well, if it's just going to be a place that serves as my shitpost central, then I can dedicate a whole separate account for the art stuff specifically. And that's kind of how the whole Whisper stuff emerged, to be honest. Because I've been compulsively documenting things about the space and really about art culture from day one. But I was actively trying to fight this idea that it should all be under the same quote unquote brand, i.e., myself. Then I realized that it's just not feasible. Or if it is feasible, it would be extremely difficult to maintain, especially as someone who runs solo. So I think what was really helpful for me as far as insights goes was to realize that, oh, I can just start to disseminate ideas about things and come up with a way to package these ideas in a certain fashion where it fits, my overall narrative. And it doesn't necessarily have to say that I made it, as long as it exists out there and people can see it and consume it. That's there, whether it's the photography work I've done or the music work I've done, or in this case, the documenting slash podcasting and writing work I've done. All of that can live in its own separate little bubble, and it don't necessarily have to overlap. Even though at the end of the day, I'm the one person brand behind it all. You know what I'm saying?
Right. No, I get what you're saying for sure. I mean, fuck, there's so many different ways of going about the strategy for building, the quote unquote brand. And I think, like, say, in the case of what you're doing with Wizpill, like that, yeah, that's more of like a brand type of thing. I think a lot of the things that we're talking about too, like, could really just be considered as like generalized statements, which also aren't always helpful, right? Like, we have to keep in mind that there's so many different people, so many different ideas and ways, approaches, to this thing that everybody has, and everybody has something different. And so, like, to say that everybody is disingenuous would be a lie. It just wouldn't be factual, right? But to also, say that everybody is genuine here is also a lie. And I think it is more, like, at least I can only speak from like few, or I can only speak from like personal experience, like what I've encountered here, but I do feel like it's few and far between, and that most people do tend to operate on the spectrum of it all being a business, which, I think, yeah, you kind of have to, especially when like certain amounts of money are getting involved. But to say that that doesn't take away from creating, that doesn't take away from the type of art that you make, I feel like would also be a lie. So there's a lot of different paradoxical situations going on here in Web3 and like the art world in general. I just think like we're getting to a point with society where we have the opportunity to do things differently. We have the opportunity to cultivate things a little bit better than maybe we had in the past, whether that's, making sure that, artists, people of color, like, get spotlighted, people that are, LGBTQ, like, get spotlighted, people that traditionally weren't able to get into any of these, like, institutions. And so, I don't know, I just think there's a lot of things that, as a whole, as a community, we could look at and do differently.
Yeah. You know, the the last thing I'll say about this whole branding stuff, for me at least, when I think art, right, I think opportunities, and it's very interesting to me that there's this compulsion that I'd argue that all artists have to share is to share, they want to share their stuff with the world, and suddenly, when it comes to doing the work to share the thing, suddenly, like there's crickets, no one wants to do that work. And I hate to be like that, but if you want to be seen, the platform is not going to do the job for you. Matter of fact, if you think of the internet as one big platform that has a user base of over 4 billion and counting people, how do you realistically expect to just put something out into the ether that is the internet and without doing much strategizing, hoping to get someone to find it or get back to you? It is close to none, right? And that's exactly what marketing is in the digital age, is this idea that, yeah, you can post the art, sure. You can just, have this finished, image and, you render that and you post that JPEG on OpenSea or Instagram or whichever other platform that's equivalent, but at the end of the day, is it that you're actively inviting people to participate in that conversation that your art generates, or are you just content to post it on its own? And if that's the case for the latter, then cool. There's no issue for me here at the end of the day. If you're content to just post and you move on with your day, then cool. But if you do post as an artist and you're complaining that things are not working the way you want it to, a little bit of introspection goes a long way, the self, and artists obviously are very self-critical kind of people, but this is, at least for me, this is one of my most valued super weapons, because I take that self-critique and I turn it into a self-analyzing machine that constantly breaks down ideas and concepts and strategies for me to implement at a later time, at a later date. And that refines my approach the more I keep on doing it. And ultimately, I'm the one who benefits. And that's exactly how I've been able to, even though I don't quote unquote get that traction that you speak of, and I'm not in that, cool kids club, it doesn't matter that at the end of the day, I still have access at a moment's notice if I want to, as you're already aware by now. And that really goes into the way I've been particularly moving into the space. And I chose to put myself out there where I know that certain places have a certain role to play, and I let them play their role accordingly, and then I move on.
No, I feel that. I mean, I definitely agree, um, in terms of like people needing to take a good look at themselves here and be like, oh, maybe this is actually at least partially my fault. Maybe there's some things that I could be doing differently. And like, I agree with that for sure with myself because I think there definitely is a difference in the way that I've operated in Web3 from like the beginning times that I got here, let's say like 2020 through mid 2022. I want to say like during that time period, I was more like, oh yeah, like this is a brand, like we need to do X, Y, and Z every day, and contact this many people and run this many spaces, and that's what's going to generate sales. And I think that to a certain degree, for me at least, like I just got tired of it. Honestly, like I was just like, this isn't really something that I enjoy doing. Like if somebody were to come along and be like, hey, I'll do all this for you if you just give me like 10% of your sales, I would be like, please, like by all means, I would love for you to do that because I don't know, like in the last like year, I spent about a year in almost absolute isolation watching this property out in the middle of the Mojave Desert, like 17 acres of land, and it was me on the 17 acres and literally nobody around me for like 2 miles. Um, and so I had a lot of time to just like think about the shit in life that I actually enjoy and think about, the concept of manifesting the life that you want to have. Cause like personally, I feel like I've struggled enough. And if there's something that I really don't want to do, I think that I should find a way to get that need accommodated somehow, right? So that later on in life, I don't have to do the things that I don't necessarily want to do. And I've discovered that I personally just don't enjoy doing that type of shit. Like, I know it's necessary. I know personally that's why some of my sales have suffered. It was really hard to make money here in Web3, especially in 2022. Haven't had too many sales this year. Um, and so there's like an internal struggle going on, from my perspective of being like, okay, I know this is something that I hate doing. And it takes up a lot of fucking time and it really exhausts me mentally and emotionally to sit there and do things that I feel like come from a disingenuous place. Um, or should I just suck it up and say that, oh, this is just what I need to do and this is just a part of it, which, as time goes on, I feel like I lean a little bit more towards like just needing to suck it up. But I can't lie and say that my lack of a desire to market myself hasn't impacted some of my sales. But it's like, if you really look at it, this is not something that artists have ever needed to do for themselves until social media. And that also is a double-edged sword because it's like you can take the power into your hands, like, and do all the things that like traditional galleries would do for you, but now you're overworking yourself and maybe it'll pay off, but most of the time it takes a long time. And so like that's the route I was going until I wasn't really seeing the results as often. I was going through stretches of time where I was living off of like $300 a month. Like it was just very awful and very discouraging, and just not feeling like my work's being seen. So like the whole thing just got pretty exhausting, and I think a lot of artists here are feeling that. And so I think that's why a lot of artists are probably leaving. I'm not going to be leaving. I just like to take breaks and then reassess the way that I do things. But I think that slant, that way of looking at it definitely came from that period of time of being in isolation and just realizing that like some of these relationships that I built here were not built on solid foundations, and it wasn't for a lack of my own doing. It was for the intentions of, the other parties that I was trying to build these relationships with. And that just kind of pissed me off and made me discouraged. So, but yeah, that's that.
I don't blame you at all for, having emotions tied into what you do and how you're treated because you're human at the end of the day. It's it is interesting for me though to from my vantage point as someone who creates art, um, publishes art, and also consumes art. A lot of it for me comes down to observing, what's working, at least for myself, and what's not. And I think one of the key things that I've learned a ton from is showing face in person. Ultimately, tells you a whole lot more about where you're headed and where you're at than whatever you're being exposed to on social media, because social media is curated. Social media is purposely used as a way to say certain things and put a certain image out there. And that's why I always make sure, when it comes to building relationships, I don't just make it a social media thing that I know this person on social media, because what does that really mean? Like, knowing someone for me means that, hey, I know you on a first name basis, or I can call you at a moment's notice, or I've hung out with you before, or we've had dinner before, all of these things um very are very essential, and that's another forgotten tool that artists in particular not using, because people really think of social media as this like replacer of things that does everything for them. And then they forget that you have to have social skills, and social media, unfortunately, being an echo chamber that traps you to be in that chronically online kind of stage, like it doesn't do any of that for you. And that's why I'm personally worried about, TikTok and the impacts it's having on kids, because a lot of kids, that's their interface with the world and that's how they consume information. And there's no telling what that's going to do, both to their psyche and to even the art itself, and how it's being used and leveraged. Um, but I try not to get too pessimistic about these things, because Lord knows there's plenty to get pessimistic about. And that's really a decision I'm making at the end of the day, right? It's an active understanding of, okay, here's what sucks, here's what I want to do to make it suck less, and let's get to problem solving. And although idea for me came from learning about neuroscience and realizing that dopamine was at the core of a lot of what human beings do, because if you're thirsty or hungry, um, that's a dopamine hit that drives you to go and seek that out. And there's this concept known as duration, path, and outcome that essentially refers to this idea that you can look at how long it's going to take, where you're going to go to get there, and whatever outcome that it ultimately ends up happening. Um, and too many people overly emphasize the outcome part of the equation, i.e., I want to earn more money, or I want to be famous, or I want to be successful, whatever that means, right? I think the very subtle art that I for me have somehow managed to pull off in the midst of everything that at least for me keeps me around is that I've broken apart these bigger goals into smaller goals, and that reduces my likelihood of quitting, because now I have like I have smaller achievements to look out for, and that those little dopamine hits in between gets me that confirmation that, hey, I'm on the right track. I'm doing something that's getting me somewhere, as opposed to doing something for a long stretch of time and not really seeing any, not even outcome, just any feedback whatsoever. It's one thing to focus on the outcome, but to focus on feedback and not getting any for a long time, that is something that will almost certainly drive you to burnout. So a lot of that came from a really intense introspection, that had ultimately nothing to do with art. It was really something that was scientific in its very nature. And I feel like artists, could benefit a whole lot from implementing tools that are not necessarily art specific into their toolkit, whether it's, from the science arena or from the business arena and so on and so forth.
Right. It's funny because I feel like you picked like the topic that I'm most pessimistic about currently to like really dive deep into. I find that hilarious because I mean it's something that I wasn't very pessimistic about like a year ago, and I know that that can be harmful, and I know that like what I feel towards it is, something that a lot of artists feel, especially as of recently. And I do think that, it all ties into everything that you said. I think, again, like, you look at things from a very logical, technical perspective and like almost a mathematical perspective, I think, in terms of just how to operate here, the way that, you kind of compile certain data in your head. I think is definitely different from like the way that I operate. And it's like something that I've deemed almost as less important, whether or not that's something that I should reconsider putting a little higher on my priority list again is, yet is to be, continued or to be discovered, whatever. Uh, but there's just different aspects of the art world recently that I've just found myself caring more about. This stuff kind of like after a while it makes my brain hurt. It's just it makes the idea of reaching these goals and like becoming that artist, that you want to be that lives off of their art, like it almost makes it seem harder. And so I feel like focusing less on that aspect is what's helping me get out of burnout because I was just so intensely focused on the marketing aspect of things that I don't want to say for a while I was making work that I didn't consider to be genuine. I won't say that, but I'll say that I feel like the quality of my work and maybe the substance that was in the work was altered by the idea of like needing to make work in a certain way that appeals to the masses more, that makes it more likely that it's going to be trendy, that it's going to go viral or get, the most set of eyes. Because it's like being realistic, a lot of the collectors in the community, they go based off of the things that you're talking about. And so, of course, the idea, if you want to make money, is that you have to appeal to those people and their tastes are often vastly different from what I consider to be good. And so it's a matter of like, let me put it this way. Um, I want the work that I'm creating to ultimately stand the test of time because this is some shit that I've already done for as long as I've been alive. It's something that I will continue to do regardless if feedback is given, right? Because it's just something that I need to do. And for me, like every piece that I've been creating that comes from what I consider to be the most genuine place within me, it comes from the idea of like documenting my life, documenting events that have happened, and making sure that by the time that I leave this planet that like I have made a mark on this world, even if it's not recognized now, even if it's not recognized immediately, like I want people to know that I was here. And I know like that's definitely something about, blockchain tech that's intrigued a lot of us. It's something that, I find to be highly valuable is like the ability for that to stand the test of time, to stand the test of, weather, even like in terms of how like physical paintings over time get destroyed, things like that. We don't have to worry about now. But it's mostly like knowing that regardless of how I feel about the state of the community, the state of the market, that this is something that is at the end of the day revolutionary. It is a renaissance, even if it's not the way we wanted it to be. It is a renaissance, And whether we like it or not, the people that are currently here are actually making history. And so I know that I want to be among those people that, were considered to be great artists. And it's not even for the need to have fame, but more so, I think for me, it comes from having a lack of a voice or being appreciated, from an early age. And it's like just wanting to tell my story. And it's like this shit that I've witnessed in this life already at the age that I'm at, 23, I'll be 24 this year. I feel like, I've experienced like 40 years, 50 years in this 23-year time span. And so that's what it's about, really, for me, is like sharing the story. And so that's what I try to focus on now, instead of like the marketing aspect and hoping, that somebody, people slowly trickle in and start to realize that, like, I have some shit to say through my art, and like it's worthwhile. And it's like, I think that eventually, one day when I'm like 75 or something, that I think that maybe my life and my art can be hopefully an example to other people, and maybe through some of the things that I say can eventually provide some wisdom, or just, almost like how Frida Kahlo had a really hard life, and there's so much that she depicted in her work of that. And I think that, like, whenever people ask those questions of like, oh, well, what's your favorite artist, or like, which artist do you, revere the most? Like, I always think of Frida Kahlo, because like of where she came from, the things that she faced, the fact that, she was not recognized until the very, very end of her life, like right before she died. And to this day, like, people don't really give as much of a shit about Diego Rivera as they do, Frida Kahlo. And during her lifetime, it was always Diego. And so it's stuff like that that I find to have more, sustenance and substance, um, than it is necessarily the market. I almost believe that, like I said, there should be somebody else like doing that shit for me, because I'm not good at it and I don't enjoy it. And there's some artists that do, but that's kind of more my perspective these days.
Interesting. Um, what you speak of ties into a very narcissistic kind of tendency that all artists have, you know. Um,
Sure.
Everyone who's on social media, for me, this is the weird paradox I've observed. It's this thing that on one hand, artists will say, well, I don't really care about like who sees the work, or I don't really care about, what uh what I'm putting out there, as long as it's out there. But under the same breath, a lot of them will complain as soon as, they don't get any reaction whatsoever. So for me, that's part of like where I started to actively think about social media differently, and what that does to the mind of the person. Not so much the art, because the art is gonna be fine in my opinion. Um, and when it comes to, like you and what you're publishing and the body of your work thus far, like ultimately you speak of, being one of the greats. So what is great? Like what makes
I mean, what makes it great? I don't know. I mean, because I feel like that's kind of a blanket statement. Because, like, I don't need to be the best. That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't need to be the best. I don't need to be a Salvador Dali. I mean, at the end of the day, like, realistically, I'd prefer if I could make like 4 grand off my art a month, so that I could like shop at Trader Joe's and like have a house and shit, and just do whatever I want to do in life, and just be relatively comfortable. Like, I don't need millions of dollars. I do not need to be a Salvador Dali. I know I said that earlier, and I think that that's what it's another paradox that frustrates me, because like I grew up with a very very critical grandma that was like always is always around, just making little snide remarks and comments. And she always kind of beat it into my head that like, oh, don't be too prideful, don't have too big of an ego. And so like every step that I make up until recently, I think that thought was always in the back of my mind. It's like, oh, is what I'm doing, is that too big of an ego? Does this border the line of narcissism? Am I a narcissistic person for believing that, my story should be heard or whatever, that people should give a shit about my art? And it's just like, I think at the end of the day, like, people are going to look at you however they are going to look at you. Like, you saying that, like, it borders the narcissism line. Like, all right, maybe it does. But I think that there's literally nothing that I can do to stop other people from assuming certain shit about me, based off of the work that I create. And it's like, first and foremost, I think for me is cathartic. Like the last piece that I posted on the cusp of greatness, like for me, it really has a lot to do with like, I have this internal narrative in my head that I don't talk about a lot. I certainly haven't spoken on it publicly, but because of the things that I've faced in life, and like this really long streaks of bad luck, and just some of it's through my own fault, some of it isn't, but because of that, I have this like almost anime character perspective of like how to triumph over adversities. And I always feel like, you know, the work that I make, like especially the self-portraits and stuff, like considering that the vast majority of the work that I make are self-portraits, that it's very easy for an outsider to like look at my shit and put it into the box of being narcissistic, when at the end of the day, like it comes from a place of at least just wanting to put my thoughts out there, and just historically being surrounded by people that have like never given a shit about my perspective or my feelings. And like, this is the place that I can do that. So at the end of the day, before anything else is considered, I do create for me. And that's why I do self portraits. It is for me. And if you connect with it, you connect with it. But it's really just like blasting my own internal thoughts into the universe. And if somebody wants to grab a hold onto it, they can. But I'm not making work for everybody. Like, I know there's a lot of like controversial ways to look at that, but it is what it is. That's where I feel most drawn to and compelled to create, like that particular area. That's the way that it's been for me. I don't know how to change it. I don't necessarily know what it means or means to other people, but yeah. So maybe it's narcissism.
I don't view that, when you say you're not for everybody, that there's a certain aura of exclusivity that comes with that. And from a collector's vantage point, I think that actually will be pretty cool, because this conundrum that you also have to appeal to everyone, but also to no one, it leads to really ultimately nowhere. And self-portrait as a form of expression has always been intimately tied to the arts, and whether it's music, film making, you know, or painting and so on, a lot of that, in a weird way, it is a self-portrait, like, because it captures the very nature of your thought. And I'm pretty sure that's kind of like what drives the insanity around these so-called buzzwords, whether it's, NFT or AI, within the art community. People will feel strongly about either art. And I was curious to know, as far as your vantage point goes, how's that going? Like, as someone who's been as involved into the art as it gets, and seeing the discourse around these specific aspects of it, arts as pertaining to the NFT space and arts as pertaining to the AI space. Because right now, as I'm scrolling, I literally just saw an artist on their profile. In their bio states the following: 18, designer, background artist, streamer. Their email is plugged in there, and at the very end it says no NFT. Views on my own.
Or so like what exactly what exactly do you mean? Like, are you talking about how I feel about the different genres within NFTs? How do I feel about the discourse that, you know, outsiders, people that aren't involved in NFTs like feel about
It's
NFTs?
interesting that you think of the people that I guess are not involved in the space as outsiders, because let me try and pin their stuff real quick so perhaps you could get a better idea. But for me, it's been interesting to, from my vantage point, I try to actively avoid echo chambers. I think echo chambers are the death of learning and the death of self improvement. And, at the very beginning, I've seen the response of what AI art and NFT art represented, within the so called art community. A lot of people were vocally against it for the longest of time and still are to this day. And I'm trying to get a sense of, as far as reaction goes, what is your reaction to that discourse? And I just pinned it, by the way, so you should be able to see it by now.
In terms of like the people that are vehemently against like NFTs, I mean, I think in general, I guess I get what you're saying too with the AI thing because it's very similar. It's funny how AI has developed its own like version of that within the NFT community. It's like everybody's got to find a reason to further categorize and I don't want to say hate on, but like ostracize, I think is maybe a better word, certain groups of people for utilizing certain tools. But I think realistically, in the long term of things, like eventually all this shit is going to be normal. And so whenever people come through with a new idea or a new way of doing things that challenges the former status quo, I think there's always going to be pushback to that. And you see it in the community with AI. You saw it especially in 2021, like after people had, a $69 million sale, like the atmosphere of art Twitter, because prior to, the bull market, like the run that we had that year, I think that art Twitter was really just art Twitter and like everybody was kind of just in one area. And now it's a little bit more segregated. Like there's certain entire groups of artists that have segregated themselves from artists that do NFTs. And so I don't know. I think there's a certain level of people needing to be performative about shit in life, and that goes for so many different things. Like people love to be performative, and I feel like that falls into that category because like the biggest issue that people had with NFTs was like, oh, it's fucking, ruining the environment. Okay, well, then they provide solutions, go to Tezos, or, what they just did with Ethereum. So it's like there's solutions that are happening. We know it's brand new tech. We know that it's not going to be like that forever. And there's certain people that understand that and have taken advantage of what, blockchain technology and the community has had to offer at an early on time period to where it was, not being done. Maybe it was less acceptable, and those are the people that get ostracized. And so it's just this runaround shit. Then with the AI thing, and they did it with NFTs too. I watched them do it with NFTs. Like in the beginning, when people were first getting pissed off about that, they were saying that a ton of art that was being sold on like Foundation and Super Rare, Known Origin, whatever, OpenSea, like was stolen artwork. And now they've like pushed that over to AI and they're saying the same thing about AI. And it's just like, I've made this low key kind of controversial Twitter thread. I feel like you quote retweeted one of the tweets, but it was about um how I was comparing AI work to collage work, and I literally tweeted that thread and walked away from my phone for like a day. I didn't check any of the comments, none of that shit. But it came from a thought. It was probably a high thought I had because I do smoke a lot of pot. Um, but I just thought about how like maybe 100 years ago, like collage work wouldn't have been considered an actual form of art. Like, if you think about it, you're just cutting up a bunch of pieces of other people's artwork for the most part. Like, even the people that you see that are getting like really famous off of collage work now, it's the vast majority of it is literally like just even full bodies and stuff, full pieces of other people's paintings, like collaged into their own creation. And it's like, so where's the issue with somebody doing collage work versus AI, where it's like AI takes from a number of different images and creates something that's completely different? Like, you can say you're using Midjourney and you use the blend tool, like you put like 5 images together. None of those 5 images are really going to come out looking like either one, or the output is never going to come out looking like either one of those 5 images. So to me, I almost look at the process of that as collage work, because even then, a lot of AI artists, their process is taking that output from, say, those 5 pictures that they blended together and added all of these keywords into the prompts and shit on top of. They take that and they blend it even further down, and so it's never even recognizable to the starting point. So that reminds me in itself of collage work. And so people are saying that AI work is always just a straight rip off of other artists' styles. And it's just like, certainly there are people out there that are taking advantage of it and utilizing it in a malicious way to make it so that, they're basically just coming out with outputs that look like other artists' work. But if you really dig deep and you find like people that are truly utilizing this shit for the tool that it is, you see that they just include it in their process. And half the time, I've spoken with plenty of artists that utilize it in their process, and you would never even guess that they utilize AI in any sort of way. And so I think, the same argument that they have towards this shit could be applied even to just regular traditional art. Like, how many people do we know that are doing consistent numbers right now and you can't tell the difference between any of their work? Like, everyone that is doing hardcore gradient map work, like 9 times out of 10, I have to look and see who posted that because it looks like 6 other artists' work. And so that's another disadvantage with the trends, is like all of these arguments that people love to talk about all the time can be applied to a various number of different issues and different genres of work and different facets of all communities, not even just in NFTs. This is just like a human problem. Everybody always wants to like find a way to have a hot take or to be upset about something and leverage that as a reason for why, somebody should buy your art versus, a different person's art. And so, that's personally the way that I see it. All this shit together that we've talked about today is why I find myself caring so much less about what's going on social media and the things that people are talking about versus just the actual shit people are doing. And I think that like, going back to something you said earlier, like how you prefer like real life meetings and things like that over doing everything over the internet. I think it's like a pendulum. I think, people got so excited in the beginning at the idea of being anonymous and being able to make art and sell art for ridiculously high numbers and literally never have to show your face anywhere. And now people are realizing that lack of human connection, that lack of like knowing who that person is in person and really knowing like what that person is like is also kind of harmful. And so now I think people are swinging more in the direction of knowing that they need to take Web3 into real life and go to these events and talk to these collectors in person. And it's like you go from one extreme to another because that one extreme that you're used to just kind of starts to show its other side, like its other nastier side. So that's, just some observations that I've made. Hopefully that answers your question and that was what you're looking for.
It's interesting that you say that's what I'm looking for. Really, yeah, asking questions and really having conversation by its very nature implies that, there's an end goal, but I've tried to explain in our conversation thus far. I think making the end goal a priority, this is the point, and that's exactly why I personally feel a lot of artists in the space are struggling, whether it's from the NFT standpoint, the AI standpoint, and so on. It's because so much of what is being discussed is wrapped to a binary kind of status. It's either it's the end goal or it's the beginning, like there's no nuance whatsoever. And conversations, I find, is like the best and most effective way to have a nuanced understanding of people and what they do and what they make and why they make it. And when it comes to you and the art that you've made so far, I for one didn't even think about the aspect of that self-portrait that you talk about, because I've seen quite a lot of that and quite a lot of like interesting imagery from you that borders on the insane at times. I'm assuming you have a comment or response to make to that.
Oh no, I just love what you said. Keep going.
No, but like, yeah, I mean, like, this is clearly someone, at least from my own interpretation, who's tortured in some capacity. I can't quite tell in what way, but the thematics I detect and indicate, at least for me, that there's kind of like a love affair situation, being depicted here, and it's not exactly made obvious. But there is that romantic aspect to the art. But that Romeo and Juliet kind of romance, not the more Disney happy ending type.
Oh, that's so funny. Um, yeah, no, I like that. Um, I mean, it's not wrong. I think that, yeah, I'm definitely a tortured person. I feel like it's important to be vulnerable. I've never been afraid of telling people, how I feel or what I'm really going through. But yeah, I mean, for me, the last few years have been really hard. Um, I would say for the last 3 or 4 years, I probably cry like 4 times a week, dude. So like a lot of the art, it does come from that, and the certain things that I went through, and that's why I feel like I was gonna say earlier, I think a lot of us are just missing the point here because it's like, okay, we want fame, we want money, but it's like all those things are not really at the end of the day the center of life. They're just additives, they're just things, they're just materialistic possessions. And like at my core, I'm a really spiritual person, and there are certain things that I value, and one of those things is love. And it's like I've been fortunate enough in my lifetime, and you could argue unfortunate enough in my lifetime, to have you know really truly loved people. And a lot of the pain that I think you see in the work that I create is from losing those people. And that's why, people can say whatever the fuck they want to say about my art and the self portraits, whether it's narcissistic or pretentious or what have you, whatever you want to say. But the thing is, I think the core reason why I created, like, if you really knew, you would understand and look at it from a different perspective. Because personally, I am somebody that's in a lot of pain. Like, and I think, like, I kind of make art from a similar place, like I said, that like Frida Kahlo makes art, or like say Francis Bacon made art, people like that. And it's just, it scares a lot of people away. There's a certain level of insanity to some of it. And I wanted to do it in my own way, in very subtle ways, because I've always been ostracized in my life, in my personal life, my relationships with people, for being really like uh, emotional, really intense, like deep down. And I think that in the past I've been too like insecure, and I don't have enough confidence to like stand on certain things. And so even in that last piece that I did, that I think is the first one that you penned up, the one I was talking about earlier on the cusp of greatness, like I did something in that piece that I don't think I've ever really done, which is actually write what I'm thinking. Like I love to add shit that looks like writing. Like I was doing these like spiritually, energetically fused like symbols, like that were obviously, you couldn't read them or anything, but to me, like when I was writing these symbols on my artwork, like I would think really intensely about which words I was writing. And so energetically, I was hoping that people would be able to feel the emotion that I was trying to convey, that was the emotion behind the words I was really thinking. But I never wanted people to know what I was actually talking about, because, well, first and foremost, I don't want people to judge me, like I don't want people to have a reason to say certain shit about me. And it's like deep down, I'm a very spiteful, angry person because of some of the losses that I've felt. And that's not something that people enjoy. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to be exposed to it. And a lot of what I create comes from that anger that I feel, having lost these beautiful things in life that were like life-changing, beautiful things. And now I'm at a point in my life where I'm realizing that I don't give a flying fuck what people have to say about me in regards to how intensely like I feel certain things. And it doesn't matter what people have to say about me. And that was something that I was not able to do, not even like 6 months ago. And so the idea of like being confident and like putting these certain things into my art is almost like a rebellious thing for me now, because I've spent so much of my life being like put into a basically like a dark closet, like any time that I've tried to express myself. And so there's certain uh energetic limbs that I've allowed to be severed time and time again, if that makes sense. Like I've cut myself down to become this version of a person that everybody around me wants me to be. And so now I'm kind of like stretching my arms out, my legs out, kind of feeling around, realizing that I have the power to be whoever I want to be. And that at the end of the day, like how I feel about it is really the only thing that matters, because people are going to come and go. People are going to say what they want to say, and you can't let that shit affect you. So, but yeah, on the flip side of all the negative shit that I just said that fuels my art, like I have a deep, deep love for people. Always have. I've always, like I was raised by my hippie grandparents for certain intervals of my childhood, off and on. And one thing that, my grandpa would always say to me growing up was like, the only thing you really have to do is uh, follow the golden rule. That's what he used to say. Follow the golden rule, which is treat other people the way that you want to be treated. And so growing up, I did that. And, you encounter a lot of people that don't treat you the way that you want to be treated, even if you're treating people with that same respect and that dignity. So you reach a certain phase in your life where you are angry, spiteful and you hate people because they've kind of like made your existence miserable, and you don't understand why people can't follow the golden rule. So coming to this phase now, I'm realizing that by treating people the same way that I want to be treated, it doesn't mean that I have less personal power when they choose to act a certain way that goes against that rule. That knowing that that's on the other people, right? And so that's kind of allowing me to open up again to like really enjoying human beings, right? And like all the things that make people great, like love. Love comes in a million different forms, and it basically is the center of everything that I create. Everything kind of trickles off of that one center point of just loving people, whether it's romantically or friendship wise, just loving humanity and all the things that they do. And for me in the past, it was romantically. There was, somebody that I really loved, somebody that was kind of like a prototype, I think, for what I actually wanted in life. It didn't work out or anything, and I loved other people, but it kind of just gave me an idea of what it was that I was actually looking for. And prior to that, I really didn't think it existed. I thought that like I always had to accommodate everybody else that came into my life. But when I met that person, I realized like, holy shit, like there is somebody out there that's like cut from the same cloth as me, and I don't have to do anything to, enjoy that. And so that kind of sparked a revolution in me. So I think that's what you're seeing and describing.
So, for one, I appreciate you for even discussing these things. And for two, um, that intensity that you speak of, that's an intensity I see in a lot of people. I think the difference is just that you manifest that and you put it out there and you're not shying away from it, and that's a great quality to have. And that would be my elevator pitch as to why you're great and why collectors should be seeking you out. Because ultimately, what does the collector want, right? It's the bragging rights. This idea that they get to say that they've been onto something before anyone else. And I mean, I don't think anyone exemplifies that more than you, as far as what you've said so far and the nature of your work.
So, well, thank you. I really do appreciate that because, um, sorry, I had a cough. I was smoking. But yeah, I don't think that, well, it's not often that I have people that are really diving like that deep into the work that I'm putting out. And like I always really appreciate that when people like actually take notice of some of those more subtler things. And it's because I do like talking about it. I mean, I think everybody likes to talk about their work, but that intensity too is like this shit builds up in me. And so like getting it out, telling the story makes it feel better when it builds up. So
So, I think we'll try and like hone in on a few more questions and kind of get like that. I guess as good of a picture as we can get of you, because we've discussed your stance on marketing, your stance on the NFTs and AI art and intensity and intentionality and all these things. But I do think another aspect that perhaps needs to be discussed is your womanhood, and how does that affect or impact what you make, and how does that impact your experience, in the arts world and really as a person?
that's a great question. Um, well, first and foremost, I think the easiest place to start is probably, kind of in line with where we were just at, the intention behind the art, because the womanhood aspect of that does play a role into that. And I think of, I almost named one of my recent pieces this, but it's a saying that my grandma always said to me growing up too. They love their sayings. But it was, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And I think that as of recently, like within the last few years, especially since 2020, that's been a big theme. And so I think a lot of the work that I've come from kind of like fits into that category, and it has a lot to do with, you know, I've been in a lot of situations where, well, let's take, my stint out in this property, for example, the one where I was like isolated out there by myself. Um, the guy whose property it is like, he's an older guy. He used to work in law enforcement. He has very traditional views on everything. Like, I would be getting into like political fights with this guy because he would be telling me the craziest shit, like about Trump. And I had to have like a 3-hour conversation with him about how he was being like low-key racist. But basically, he comes from that boomer generation, and he gives off certain vibes of like not really respecting my word or respecting my time and my energy, because I'm a young woman. And in one of those ways was, he paid everybody else that watched his property $750 every 10 days, and he didn't pay me like anything for the whole year that I was there, and I was the only person that he did not pay. And so I spent the last year out there living off of like $300 a month, while he's like doing whatever he's doing, worried about making all this money. And so that's like one example of a situation that I feel like I've encountered. And like, I've tried to have conversations with this guy about like, hey, like maybe you should pay me, like maybe you should, help me out with this or that or whatever in exchange for doing this favor for you. And it's always like, I've gotten yelled at, and like I'm never allowed to tell my story. So that type of shit has been happening in my life for the last several years. I was in a really bad relationship with somebody that just took advantage of me. Really crazy. That was terrible. But in terms of like the community and stuff, one thing that I did notice a lot of, besides the obvious fact that there really aren't a lot of top creators that are female, people that are being highly paid in the community are generally like your average like middle-aged white dude, which unfortunately is just how it's been for the last probably 1,000 years or something everywhere. But aside from that, I noticed smaller things, like when I used to host the dark art show. I started that with Nihilus, the photographer in Today's Night, and we started it because both Nihilus and I have similar work in different genres. We create very dark stuff. We create stuff that is generally not emotionally appealing to the average collector. So we wanted to showcase people that were making work in that genre and really highlight the people that were, creating from a similar place that we were creating from. And eventually, pretty quickly, it became just me running it, because I don't think Nihilus was as into it as I was. So like 2 weeks into it, it was like me organizing all the interviews, setting everything up, and then ultimately just me interviewing everybody. So I did that for a while. I did that for a few months, and it was just me. And eventually I brought Dre on, Andres Gizil. I always mess up his last name. It's a Gilboing, I think is how you say it. Like, love him, fantastic. Fantastic dude. I used to call him my professional question answerer because I would bring him up on stage to elaborate on, some of the topics that I was asking, some of the artists that we would interview, and eventually he became my co-host. Now, as much as I love Dre, something started to happen when I did that. Um, so I noticed that I was no longer getting the space to like talk in my own interviews. And it got to the point where people that we would bring up on stage would just straight up talk over me. Like we had this one guy who would just who talked over me like 6 or 7 different times to the point where like even Dre had to tell him to stop, and eventually we kicked him out. And so in the beginning when it was just me, there was a certain level of respect that I was getting from the people in the audience, and a certain level of just and in respect in the way of like just allowing a person to talk, right? Um, so after a while, once I introduced like a male co-host to the show, it was no longer like people didn't even associate it really with me. And so that's one of the reasons why I just got fed up with spaces, was because I didn't really understand how I could be somebody who started something that went on to influence like so many other spaces, like different interview shows and, the general vicinity of where I was at in the community, and to be completely forgotten like 4 months after I introduced like a friend of mine onto the show. And suddenly like I felt like I got drowned out into the background. And so it was a chore for me to be there, because I knew that every single time that I opened my mouth, people weren't really caring about anything that I had to say. And it was just a constant thing that I would see occurring. And so that's really where the frustration for me came in, because once I noticed that was happening and people around me weren't really doing anything to help me out with that, because I was in a situation where I didn't feel like any opinion that I voiced about it was going to matter, because the people in the audience weren't going to listen. Like at that point, I was almost powerless to how it went. And I just thought, like, fuck it. Like, why am I going to sit here and do all this work, highlight all these people, and just for everybody else to come in and basically like push me out of my own shit? And so it just got frustrating. I think that as a woman has been the most annoying thing that I've encountered. I don't think I've had too many other experiences. Like I've never had somebody say like, "Oh, it's, because you're a woman." But just, on a more like a micro level passiveness, I guess. That was the situation that like really showed me that there is a dichotomy here, and that there still is issues with that. Because before then, I wasn't entirely convinced, because, when I was running it by myself, I didn't encounter that issue at all. So I thought it was just so interesting how as soon as I brought Dre on to co-host, like suddenly everybody assumed that it was his show. And he didn't do anything wrong. I just want to put that out there. Like Dre is a super dope guy. Like I love Dre. He stood up for me like quite a few times, but to be honest with you, they didn't really listen to him either. So he didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't really his fault. It was just somehow the atmosphere. And so the only thing that I can think of was that Dre was a well-spoken man versus a well-spoken woman, and it had, nothing to do with us as people or our relationship, as friends together, right?
I see. Yeah, and to further exemplify what I'm talking about, one of the folks I showcased here on the Whiz platform is Natalie, and Natalie is a filmmaker, vlogger, and YouTuber, and they've spoken about the experience, on how they get perceived in their comment section, particularly by seemingly older middle-aged adults and women, and these comments say such things as "no more cuss words, sweetie," or "I'm surprised YouTube allows so much bad language. I'll keep watching to see if you get control of your words." My daughter's name is Natalie. Please don't post a stupid word. Some post like stopping in the middle of the street. Um, and it's not cool to use bad language on YouTube. And this is from a person that's like, their name is Barbara. It's kind of funny. Um, and the last one, good video. I am being a mom here. Sorry, less cursing. You don't need to. And their response was, bro, why are all my comments flaming me for cussing? Can YouTube please stop doing this? Blah 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 blah. So point being that like, yeah, people being policed for their speech in that kind of fashion, I don't see that a whole bunch, when it comes to dudes versus chicks, without a doubt,
No, that's so fucking weird, to be honest with you. Like, I luckily haven't had to deal with that issue. I think I'd probably just cuss them out and block them. I probably wouldn't cuss them out because I'm pretty civil these days on my own Twitter. I try to keep it cool and cordial. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of a lot of crazy things happening to women in the community. Like, well, I went to NFT NYC in 2021, and one of the people that I hung out with most was, I believe they were non-binary, but they would also went by she, her pronouns too. So, but they were very like female presenting, and they made a sale at a bar, and I was there when they made the sale, and basically they were getting these crazy comments saying that the only reason that they made that sale was because the collector was like trying to fuck them. And I know that that happens, but it's like, and the thing that we don't talk about a lot too sometimes is that unfortunately sometimes other females do perpetuate this shit. Like, they definitely add on top of it, and like that's something that I have felt in my personal life. Um, like, kind of going back to my experience at that property, like this. Okay, so the toilet broke for like the whole month of December out there. And I found out that the reason why the guy that lived like 10 minutes down the street from me didn't come fix my toilet was because his wife swore up and down that I was going to be like sleeping with her husband when he came over there to fix my toilet. So I went without a toilet for the entire month of December because this lady had it in her head that like I was this girl out there trying to like sleep with her husband. And I'm like, ma'am, I've been celibate for literally 2 years, but okay. So it's things like that, and going back to the comments that were made to this particular person that I was with, they took it really hard. And I think some of the people that said those things to them were also women. And so you've got these people that are like dead ass pick me's, that are literally just perpetuating it. And so I don't put my like personal selfies out there often. Like, there's a few every once in a while I'll post a selfie or something, but for the most part, I don't think that like people are really looking at the way that I look. But I know that if I did, I feel like I would encounter more of these situations, which is actually the sole reason that I don't post selfies often. And I think that the second that you're like really perceived as a woman here, or especially like if you're somebody that has like pretty privilege, like I feel like you probably encounter that like to a certain degree a little bit more because there's a lot of like thirsty dudes out here. There's those stories of those collectors that were like basically organizing like all these different back channels and shit that were just like taking advantage of the girls and like making the women like fight against each other so that hopefully somebody would make some money somewhere from this one collector. I forget who it is, but it's just like, you hear a lot of stories of that. People are very condescending. People assume certain things about you because you're a woman, and it's like, even if they're not being direct with it, like there's certain passive things that people do here that allude to that get on my nerves, like the whole just interrupting you. And I've seen it happen to other girls here too. Like I've seen it happen to a ton of women in spaces. It is like dead ass across the board. That's the one thing I've seen happen more than anything else, is just women literally never get like the space to talk in spaces. Like there's always some crusty dude there like ready to talk over a girl. Like,
I
um,
see.
yeah.
And I very much understand the frustration. And I think it's not exactly something I personally experience, and I can't quite tell you why that might be, because do I do spaces often? Yeah, but I tend to take the approach of I have a truth bomb kind of approach to the way I speak on spaces. I don't talk a whole bunch, but whenever I do talk, I'll just say something, then drop the mic, and then hop on out. And that's sort of reputation that has gone with me and the way I do things. Can give the wrong impressions of me sometimes. To the point where I've had women say things about me that I find quite interesting and funny, but also kind of frustrating and heartbreaking at times too, because I've been told that I say certain things only because I'm a dude saying it or something along those lines. And yeah, I get the sentiment ultimately, and I get why they say these things. But it's very similar to, another creator that I respect in the space, they have a very bassy, boomy voice. And whenever they do speak on spaces, like it overwhelms basically everyone else. And they'll get this whole comment of, why do you keep interrupting people? Why do you speak over women? When the guy doesn't really do that. Like, he's opinionated, yeah, but like, I think the way he sounds gives this impression that like he commands attention and power, which could not be further from the truth. He's a very understated kind of guy, and it's also worth mentioning, like, he's like barely 5'8", which is like on the on the shorter side of things.
Sorry for laughing.
No, I mean, like, we're bantering.
My short kings.
Yeah, like, respect to the short kings, and short royalties in general. It doesn't matter if you're tall or short. That's not the point of, the value that you have as a person. But the point I was making though is that, yeah, like, in spaces, even though I'm grateful that spaces has introduced this ability for more nuance, but even then there are misconceptions being made about people based on how they sound, whether it's from an accent perspective. I could name you how many times I've had people before and after knowing exactly what race I am, specifically act differently as a result of that information. And typically it's along the lines of, wow, you're also well spoken, or wow, you are so intelligent. And it's like, you were not pointing any of that out before, were you? And that frustration I definitely get, and personally, the way I manage that comes down to really speaking in spaces, and I don't mean, Twitter spaces, I just mean literal spaces where I know for a fact um, I'm valued there as a person, not just as a voice or a mind, because I feel like at that point, there's much more opportunity for people to interact on equal grounds. And yeah, women, and really all the internet have had it rough, and that commentary you've made about selfies, we are on that same playing field where we don't really make our personhood the center of what we make. You don't post selfies at all or rarely, and I, on the other hand, made up a whole character altogether that you've made some interesting comments about before. Um, but the point being that, like, yeah, that never really was a priority. But I do notice that depending on, that pretty privilege you speak of, across the board, everyone has it and everyone leverages it in some capacity, which is why on TikTok, people that are really famous there and really blowing up there, they have that attractive factor in common. And my question to you has more to do with, how does that impact you in terms of, social media and beauty standards? In that conversation, when it comes to how you're appreciated, and how you're valued, or is there any value at all in appreciating someone in that way? Especially given the fact that, these days there's this conversation kind of going on Twitter, which, tend to be pretty toxic in my opinion, that talks about the fact that using your quote unquote body is cheating, or using your body is what's the word I'm looking for here? Distasteful, or something along those lines of body shaming, sexual shaming, whichever you want to call it, someone typically because they're attractive, but definitely because they're a woman in that kind of aspect, and having that get the attention, not what they think or what they make.
Um, so I feel like I've felt different ways about this topic at different times in my life. Like, I mean, because I've heard people say the argument that, like, oh, the naked body is art too. And it's like, oh, I can't deny that, right? Because, like, there was a period of time where, for some reason on my timeline, I was getting a lot of women that were, like, posing butt naked next to their art. And it would just be, like, a painting of, like, a bored ape. And they'd be, like, butt ass naked. And, like, part of me feels like that detracts from, like, your actual work. But then someone made the argument to me that, like, oh, well, you know what, that's like part of the art too. And I kind of changed my opinion on that, because, like, the way that I've always looked at it is, like, for me, at least me personally, I don't want people to support my art because of the way that I look. And I don't feel like art should be supported because of the way that someone looks in any capacity, right? Like, I feel like we should just not perceive people. Like, I feel like we should just enjoy the art and, like, take the experiences for what they are, and what gets, or what comes from those experiences, and becomes the art itself. And so I'm kind of like, I'm just more of the opinion that I I don't necessarily hide myself away, because, like I said, I think I posted a selfie recently, but it's just not something that I do because I'm aware of, like, the subtle implications of what that will do. And so, yeah, I think that, again, another double-edged sword. I think that you can totally leverage, especially as a woman, you can totally leverage that shit and use that as part of your marketing. And there is a lot of girls that do that shit successfully, and they make a lot of money, by leveraging that. And it's like, more power to them. If that is particularly the way that you want to go, because I can see the mindset behind that, because it's like, if you have it, use it, right? Um, but for me, I really like I really just want to be respected for the art itself. Like, I don't want any other, like, external factors deciding whether or not somebody, like, wants to fuck with my work, past the fact that it's, the art that I create and, like, who I am as a person. And so for me, I feel like when you throw in, like, what I look like into it, which I have been told, like, yo, leverage that shit, like, time and time again by other guys that I know. But I just don't want to, because, like, I know, like, the certain attention that comes with it. Like, because then you get people posting stupid ass comments, like the ones they were posting underneath this particular girl's post, right? Like, about, oh, needing to do this, that, and the third, calling her sweetie, sweetheart, when, like, people start making these generalizations about you, like you said. Like, as soon as people know where you're from and what you look like, they start saying, oh, you're so intelligent, like, oh, you're so well spoken. Like, okay, so, like, the rest of the people where I'm from are, like, not well spoken and they're not intelligent, right? Like, that's what that means. 'Cause, like, you weren't saying that shit before when you didn't know what I look like. And I think it's similar for, like, women, in the sense where, like, then, like, yes, you can leverage it, yes, if you want to, you can take advantage of it, but there's still going to be consequences for doing that. And I feel like that's like a hot take for sure. That, but I feel like it's reality, right? Because like we already know that in general, like women are less respected, they're paid less, especially here. We already have the statistics to like prove that women artists in Web3 are not generally being paid as much as like male counterparts are. And like that shit comes from the collector base. That comes from like the actual culture of and the way that people think here, because like those are the people that are collecting. It's like, how do they feel, that this person's work should be valued? Like most of the time, like, I mean, the artist can decide it, but it's really it. Hold on, my brother's okay. The artists like set the prices, right, but the collectors are the ones that decide whether or not they want to pay that. And so it's like you see a ton of people that are known in the community making $50,000 sales, $60,000 sales, and like there's not a ton of women that are doing the same. Like, I mean, the first person that comes off the top of my head is like Claire Silver. um I'm sure there's other people too, but I could probably name like 10 dudes that make sales like that, like Terrell Jones, Omite Hogan, Tijo, Photon and Dead, like all these people are all like men that make those numbers, right? Like Ferocious, even though Ferocious is trans, like that's like still male presenting. He's like, so there's all these different things. Like there's all these different consequences for deciding to market yourself in that way. And it's like, yeah, you could make a lot of money. You could rally a lot of supporters based off of that. But I think in general, like as far as art goes, I feel like we should just value people inherently for the work that they're creating. And I think that's another reason why I have issues with like, say, International Women's Day just passed by, and like everybody's doing the all women, curated shows and shit. And it's like you have all these spaces that are just women, and it feels like, you're being put off into this different category and being told that, oh, you can be successful within the parameters of this realm and be considered a top quote unquote female artist, but like you're not going to be considered just one of the top artists in general. Like you have to be put into that box based off your gender, which is like really annoying. When if you just throw all of that shit away and put everybody into the same category and base it off of like the actual art itself, then we wouldn't be running into that issue if that was the way that people viewed it. And that goes for more than just women, like people do the same shit with people of color. It's like it's pretty much everywhere.
I had to rush and unmute because Twitter is such a Elon Musk, man. Fix your platform. Yeah, honestly, yeah, hats off to you. Like I have I have no real comments to make as far as what you just said and elaborated upon. I do think that you speak quite eloquently, and I really don't mean this as a backhanded insult about your experience, as an artist, as a woman, and as a person. And that further emphasizes for me as to the why, as a collector, should be more than other to have your work in their body of collection. Actually, there should be running to you as we speak. But marketing and platforms and the good old classic misogyny or in the good old way of that happening, and I'm hopeful. I do think that that future is in store for you. I do think that my small contribution, if that might be that this podcast or the publications I run, I'm hoping that further helps in making that happen.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, honestly, just like being a cool person and wanting to do this, I really appreciate a lot, especially having done a lot of other people's interviews. Like, I haven't had too many people that have, like, I definitely haven't had anybody go this in depth with me and give me that space to really talk about the things that I feel and the things that I think for this long. Because, like, we've been on this call for quite some time, and it's been very refreshing just to have that experience. So I'm pretty appreciative of that. And I think that's part of that, feedback. Like, just even hearing you say those things, like, is very, like, it kind of brightens my day. Like, it puts a smile on my face, like, multiple times in this conversation that we've had, because it's not something that people really do with my work and just who I am as a person. And I really do care a lot about what I put out and the work that I'm making, and making sure that it has like enough soul and enough emotion, enough intensity to where people can recognize that and want to know where it comes from, mostly, because um I'm an artist. Like I said earlier, I guess you could say it's narcissistic, but I do enjoy telling my story and being heard, and that's like everybody does, though,
Yeah, and ultimately, when I use the term narcissistic, I use it the same way a clinician will use the term vagina, right? There's no application there necessarily. Um, and
Oh no, it just touched a nerve because, like I said, my grandma was always like standing behind me, correcting things that I was doing, saying, "Oh, make sure you're not doing this because it's too narcissistic, or you can't have too much of an ego." And so, like, for me, that confidence that I have has always been pushed down by the thought that having that confidence or believing a certain thing about myself made me narcissistic, and in turn, being narcissistic was a terribly horrible thing that you never want to be. So I'm still trying to get over that hump of like knowing that it's okay to like believe in your own shit and to have a certain level of like self-esteem, and not confuse that self-esteem with narcissism. So like I'm still mentally trying to make sure that I don't cross over into that line. But
so we're at let's say, the phase where I have two more questions for you, and the second to last one will touch upon, some of these aspects you've hinted about when you discuss, that individual with the the Trump supporting kind of leading kind of stance. And it's it's pretty evident to me that like you're quote unquote political in what you discuss and the nature of what you discuss. But I am curious though as to what was your general response was, as an artist to the events that occurred in 2020, and that includes COVID, obviously, but that definitely includes the George Floyd uprisings at the time.
very interesting that you ask this question because, well, 2020 was a crazy ass year. And so where do I start with this one? I guess I can start by saying, first off, I got my very first apartment January 5th after I had been battling homelessness for about a year after, my grandpa passed and we lost our place to live. So, like, I had literally signed my lease for my new apartment January 5th, and I was like working two jobs, and I got laid off, and suddenly, I was just stuck in the house. So COVID at first was scary because I was literally like 2,000 miles away from all of my family. Um, and I had just like broken up with somebody basically, and like there's just a lot going on. I was transitioning from like constantly having to pack up my shit and move to somebody else's couch or rent a room or fucking sleep in a shelter. So like there was a lot of different traumas that I was having to go through, and then to be put in that isolation was like kind of terrible. But Oh, when the protests hit, I lived about 3 blocks from the SPD station that got taken over by the people, and the zone that then became known as CHOP was just a few blocks away from my house. And so sometimes I would park my car down there at Cal Anderson because they had free parking, and I didn't have the parking pass for the neighborhood. And it's like, I remember I had started dating this guy at the time who started or co-founded like the only black owned media company in Seattle. And so they were out there like recording all the protests, just doing like actual boots on the ground journalism, like literally getting their ass beat by these cops, like covered in blue dye. And it was also like kind of personal for me because I don't know if you know this, but like in 2014, my mom was actually shot by the cops, for basically she was having a mental health episode, like trying to commit suicide, and she had a squirt gun in her hand, and somebody like called the cops on her. And basically this guy took his recording equipment off, didn't tell the station that he was responding to the call, and then put like 2 shots in my mom's back. And so like I was out there every single night protesting. Um, I was like witnessing everything that was happening. I was out there from day one until it ended, and there was nothing that I could do also to escape like any of that since I lived 3 blocks from it. And every night when I would go up to smoke on my rooftop, like my eyes would be burning from like the amount of tear gas that was like in the air. Like I'm pretty sure they were dropping like pepper spray onto the crowds of protesters like from helicopters and shit, because like you would just open your eyes and it was just your eyes would just start burning. And so I also like I I don't know, it was definitely a traumatic summer, like especially the first like couple weeks of that shit was just really crazy. Like we would be out there for hours and hours and hours every night. Like there was incidents where like people had driven into the crowds of protesters, people got killed. There was a kid that got shot. I think it was by like I don't know who it was, but I don't know what group it was that came out, but they drove onto like the Cal Anderson soccer field and basically like tried to do a mass shooting, but like the civilian like patrol for the CHOP had like taken them out. And so there's just a lot going on. I think it definitely was traumatic not being able to like escape all of that, having my own like personal personal like proximity to like police brutality, and like the fact that like my mother like never got justice for any of that. Like I think the guy got fired and then got rehired like in a different position in the department, and like the whole like Long Beach Post wrote like a big article on them. And like I was just seeing dumb shit out there in the protests too. Like there's a certain culture in Seattle that's interesting. Like you've got a lot of really like performative like white people that are coming out there like screaming over like black people, not letting black people talk about shit. You had women showing up to the protests in like sandals and sundresses, like not knowing that in a moment's notice somebody was gonna throw a water bottle and everybody was about to get trampled if they didn't like get out of there quick enough. Like I even got trampled one time too out there. um Fun fact, I had the last standing mural at CHOP after they covered everything up. I did a mural for Breonna Taylor because like her particular story really like I don't know, was very impactful to me. Like I just couldn't imagine how that could possibly happen. It just didn't make any sense to me. And it was just like so tragic. And I mean all the stories are tragic too, man. I don't know. It was a very it was a very intriguing time, a very stressful, it was very frustrating seeing that people were out there for the wrong reasons, seeing that people were not like safe with anything that they were doing. The night that the precinct got taken over, was really interesting though, in a good way. Like, I would say the first like week that the civilians, like the protesters, took over the CHOP, and the precinct, was actually really cool. You had people out there like giving away tons and tons of free food. People were just living at the park, making gardens. There was art everywhere. Like, literally every graffiti writer for like hundreds of miles came out. Like, people that you'll see their shit blasted from fucking Seattle all the way down to LA and various parts of the country. Like, people were driving up there from Texas and New York and all kinds of different parts of the United States to come like participate in this thing. And so that was that, but it was also like the camaraderie, I think, of the protesters out there that I felt was really cool. Like, just to see how out there when you were protesting, it was everybody like against the system. Like, there was people that volunteered to be medics that were just walking around with like little taped crosses on their backpack, and if you needed water or if you got tear gas, like they give you milk, like just first aid, anything like that. And so seeing how like the community came together like against this one cause was like a beautiful thing to see. But during that time too, it also really like, how do I say this, made me realize that media is like not to be trusted, because I was getting all of my actual news from like live streams of people out there. And what would frustrate me is like the local news would be streaming a live stream of like some corner with like two people on it. And then I flip over to the live stream of this media company of the guy that I was seeing at the time, and they've got their reporters out there just getting doused in tear gas that's like covering them in this blue dye. And it's like, you're not supposed to be doing that shit to reporters. But the local media companies, like the, you know, big media companies like for Seattle, were not accurately reporting on the actual truths of what was happening out there. And so that's when I just completely cut out all of that media. And then, you know, there was just so much that happened that summer that eventually it just kind of became a little bit too much to handle, and I found myself more so just withdrawing and like back into nature, you know, doing shit like trying to build myself a house in the woods, like spending time away from all these places that had suddenly become like littered with traumatic events. And like, since we're on this topic, one last thing that I will say that is of a semi-traumatic, or it is definitely of a traumatic nature, but I feel like needs to be said because I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this. But one thing that happened out there that really, really just like set me off, that just like was kind of a breaking point for me that year, was towards the end of CHOP, there was a young kid that got shot. And unfortunately, I happened to be watching the live stream on Facebook of a protester friend of mine who had spoken at a lot of these rallies. And for whatever fucking reason, this dumbass decided it was a good idea to live stream this kid taking his like final breaths. And they had put him like on a picnic table, and I was one of two people that saw this. And I was sitting at my house, so I immediately went down there. And the first thing that I saw was like people were carrying like bodies out of the CHOP zone, like regular civilians, because they had ordered the ambulances and all the police to not even enter the zone. And so I sat on the sidelines a block away from where this kid was and literally watched as like 4 ambulances were just sitting right there not doing anything. And ultimately the kid passed away. And so that was the moment for me where I was like, I can't be here. Like, this is just too much. Like, there's a lot of people out here that just want to be a part of something. People were going missing. And when I saw that shit happen, I was like, I gotta get the fuck out of this place because that is the most insane, craziest thing that I've ever witnessed. Um, and that is how 2020 went for me.
You should have a movie made about you at this point, to be honest.
Um, I mean, I feel like 2020 was traumatic for a lot of people. I feel like, a lot of people experience a certain history or historical events. I mean, the entire world was protesting. Every major city in like the world was protesting, for George Floyd and all the other people that didn't have, the awareness that they should have had to their police case. Like, I think one particular case for Seattle is like Charlene Lyles had been killed unjustly by the SPD. And so, like, I mean, I wasn't even aware of that until, I went to the protest and found out about all these other cases. And so the crazy thing is that, you know, 3 years later, we don't hear anybody talking about the events that happened that year. Like, there was millions of people protesting, so many people, and yet it's not spoken about. It's just like swept under the rug, and there was minimal changes that even occurred. So,
So, with that in mind, it's only fitting that the last question touches upon, your legacy and, what people think of you and your contribution, whether it's in the arts, the political sphere, and so on and so forth. First off, what would you have as a message for everyone that may or may not hear this 100 years from now? And I'll start with that.
um, that's a that's a heavy question. That's one that definitely requires some hard thinking
Come,
because there's a million different.
coming from the one who's been so heavy this entire time.
No, heavy in the sense that like that question is like, you know, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You like one shot, I guess, in this particular
Well, one
circumstance.
would argue that in a lifetime you do have one shot, and I'll briefly mention, and as you already are aware, that I've unfortunately suffered a recent murder attempt, and that has really given me the kind of perspective that I really think very few people have. And does that come with trauma? Yeah. And I'm not downplaying it, but I do think that this idea that you in fact have one shot applies across the board, whether it's in the arts or in business or in life, and the way you interact with people. And that impact, once they're gone, is long lasting, and that includes your impact onto the world. I see that impact lasting as long as 100 years from now, because with the rise of AI and all these other tools, I think a lot of the conversation that people tend to miss out on is the opportunity for these things, whichever you want to call them, can give an extended lifespan to an artist in a way very few other mediums can. But that's besides the point. Yeah, your message.
No, I think that's kind of a good point too, because like that kind of gives me like a direction to go with. I mean, answering this question. I mean, yeah, fuck it. Everything's been heavy so far. I'm a super heavy person. Like, I'll be talking about shit that people don't normally want to talk about or mention. Um, and I guess that's just kind of who I am. But as far as something that I want to say to people, I mean, given the things that I've experienced in life, is like the first thing that does really come to mind is like on the terms of not giving up. And a lot of people say that, but like one lesson that I've learned and I've had to learn very harshly is that you need to just like trust your intuition at all times. Like you think something's happening or somebody's like, doing something that's really malicious, like 9 times out of 10, that shit might be true. Um, because there's a lot of people out there that really want to take advantage of people, and that can be something that discourages us to like connect with other people. And I think like as much as I've been in a dark time and I don't have a whole lot to share in a positive light because of that, at the end of the day, it does like end and it does get better. Like I've had my own struggles with that. And I really want to make my life an example in the way that like for me, I've been just in a negative space for so long that sometimes I wonder if I can ever get out of it. And so I recently got this new like endurance, I think, for life within the last couple of months that kind of has given me this idea that like I don't have to be anything that I don't want to be, and I don't have to conform to any of the ideas that the people around me want me to conform to become who I want to be. And I don't have to settle, and I don't have to think that, oh, I just have to live with this one thing that I really hate to in order to enjoy these other things in life. Like we're telling ourselves that like there are really people out there that live their lives with like so little adversity. They exist, and so like the idea is like even if you are somebody that has just gone through the hardest of times in life, because there's people out there that have had it way fucking worse than me. And I think like you just like have to know that it's up to you and like you get to decide. And it sometimes you have to cut out like a lot of people from your life in order to do that. And sometimes you're going to be the only person standing on one side of the room wondering if you're the person that is wrong or if you're crazy for feeling a certain way. But you should follow that shit, you know, obviously within reason. Like think about it really hard because sometimes we are also the problem. But if you have sat there and you have thought long and hard for weeks, days, months, or years, and you come to the conclusion that it maybe isn't you and maybe you deserve better in life, like please go for it. Um, and I think that's what I'm kind of working up to because there's people on this planet that deserve far better than what they've, been given. I'm not even just talking about myself, like a handful of my friends, I've just seen struggle and struggle. And I just like, one of the things that I wish I could do is like, I wish I had more money to help out those people in my life. Like, with simple things like they don't have a car and they don't even have like a way to wash their clothes and like they can't even enjoy like buying themselves a coffee in the morning. And it's just like, I think that we all deserve the life that we want. And I don't think that we should back down from the idea that we have as to what that should look like. Um, and don't give up on it either because life is tough. Life is really hard. Um, but I think that is a lot of what my art is about at the end of the day in a variety of different ways for a variety of different reasons. But I think it always comes down to the idea that the people who deserve it in terms of like, people that have just, how do I put this? Like I said, suffered adversities that, were through no fault of their own. Like, I want to see those people win, and that's a lot of what my art's about. So, yeah, I think that is probably
Very very encouraging message there. Not heavy at all. Uh and yeah, let's be like in terms of this whole journey you're on with the arts, like what's in store, for the people that are fans of yours and future fans of yours, like how do you see that evolve, and what are you cooking up?
Um, well, I think in terms of subject matter, this is that axis point in my life, that tipping point where I think a lot of the work that I've made in the past has come from that anger and that spite and that, place of lack and just the hatred I have for the things that I've been through and just the perseverance acts or like the perseverance side of it, right? And so I think what's really coming up now is the point where I get to flip that and maybe not create from such a heavy place. And now that I've done all that cathartic shit that I needed to do, and I put that down, that'll probably be all the shit that I made up till now, probably be my most punk work. But but I think what's coming up in the future is just like that that active putting everything I just said into motion. And that's what I meant by being an example, is like trying to forge this path that at least nobody in my family has forged before, and believing wholeheartedly without a doubt that things can change and things can get better. And I think ultimately the art that I make is going to reflect that. Um, Especially with me moving back to Washington at the end of the month, which is really the place that I want to be. And just having that life change, I think I'm going to start creating things from a more peaceful place, a more easy place, maybe creating things that are more beautiful in the traditional sense of the word beautiful, and not beautiful because they're destructive or they're doing all that shadow work. Now maybe I get to do some light work and I get to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Um, and in terms of the actual art career itself, um, I think, I'm going to be making art regardless. Like I said, I'm not leaving Web3 or anything like that. I'm going to continue doing my shows. I did just get brought on as the content lead for Burrito DAO, which is essentially the editor-in-chief position, like what an editor-in-chief would be like at a newspaper. So I'm in charge of all of their written content, all of the artist interview articles, things like that, any of the articles that get run through there. And so I'm just trying to take that journalistic approach with Burrito, and also like spotlighting and helping some of the artists there kind of be showcased, and just getting the shine that they deserve, which I think is a lot of what I'm going to be doing there. Because that's something I've always been interested in, is like I said in the very beginning of this interview, like there's that category of people who I feel like have that talent, that have that creative thirst, that have that capacity to become, quote unquote, one of the greats. And they also have that life story behind it, like somebody that, whose story you like just really feel for and you want to see win. Those are the people that I really just have a strong desire to like do as much as I can to help them get to the point that they want to be at. So that's going to be fun for me because that's something I really love doing. I can't wait to see what I can do with Burrito's content team, and just see where the rest of it goes.
Well, cool. I look forward to see that because I'm one of the few that has successfully beaten an algorithm, and I can see you wherever you go. Um, yeah.
That's not creepy at
No, it's
all.
definitely not. I mean, hey, we're literally talking on a platform that has over 100 million users, and at any given point, they could potentially crash in here and listen to you. So
I
being watched
know.
at all times.
Somebody's probably on their desktop.
Yeah, trying to make sense of this conversation and when it's going to finally end and put them out of their misery.
Shit.
Um,
And
yeah, that aside, honestly, I think this has been a very enlightening conversation. I think more. I personally have gained a better appreciation for the art you make and the stances you have, and really you as a person. And I wish nothing but the best for you. And I, I for one stand in your corner as a supporter, as a fan, and more importantly, as a platform that hopes to showcase, the value in what you put out.
well, thank you, dude. I really appreciate you like taking all this time out of your day and literally just letting me go on as long as I want to. I'm like, you don't. This is not the average length for your interviews, are they?
Actually, you know what? It's not in the sense that most tend to be on the hour more or less, but yeah, I mean it depends, like some of them are as long as 3 hours, but the catch is I haven't been around that long. It just so happens that I've joined that space at that specific point, and then since I've contributed in that space, I figured, well, mine now. I'm gonna rip it and put it on Spotify, which
That's
fair,
okay.
fair exchange. I will say though, and that's the last thing I'll say. There was a few artists that actually took, I guess, issue with the fact that I was taking their spaces and putting up on Spotify and actively calling for me to be reported, which is interesting because, for one, as I've said, I've contributed heavily in that conversation. So that's the same point I was coming from. But furthermore, like, okay, assuming that it's just a space and it doesn't go anywhere else, what do you really hope to do? As far as the space goes, is it just going to stay there on your account and live there until the eventual demise of the Twitter platform and Elon Musk goes crazy and nukes everything? I don't know. I feel
Well,
like there's way too much value in some of these spaces to not put them elsewhere.
I mean, I think the important thing is just to, make sure people are cool with it before you put it up there.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't know. Like, I feel like a lot of what I champion at the end of the day with the Westfield project is, bringing to light aspects of arts, culture, and tech that may have been overlooked by people, and that includes the artists, without a doubt. So, and as far as I can tell, it's working. So, there's not gonna be a stop to that anytime soon. But on that note, delve from the gutter. Uh, really appreciate your contribution and your insights, and we'll catch you around on the art world and the metaverse and the Washington world, whichever that ends up being.
No, Washington. Well, all right. I mean, I'll be around, so just let me know. And yeah, I really appreciate, you hitting me up and wanting to do this with me. And like I said, giving me that space to really go in depth and talk about, my stuff. So
Yeah,
thank you.
you're watching. And any last thing you want to plug before you head out?
I feel like we probably covered all of it.
Cool, cool. On that note, this was Whispel featuring Gutterdove, artist, woman, all around impressive figure, and we're out.
Bye.